Well, greetings, everyone. Welcome to Seminary Unboxed. This is Dr. Matt Ayars, your host of Seminary Unboxed, the official podcast of Wesley Biblical Seminary. And I have with me a special guest today for a special episode. I have Dr. Steve Blakemore to talk about AI, artificial intelligence, and theology. Welcome, Dr. Blakemore.
Hey, it's great to be with you on Seminary Unboxed. Usually I am with you in just seminary period here in our building where we're boxed in. So I'm glad to be unboxed today.
That's it. That's the idea. So interesting. For those who may not know in the audience, Dr. Blakemore is a professor here at Wesley Biblical Seminary. So we work together. We're in the same building right now. He's just down the hall in his office. I'm in mine. But he's a professor of Christian thought and theology here at WBS, but he also teaches systematic theology, historical theology. And so he's been here a number of years, senior faculty, thrilled to have him. And so to get started, Dr. Blakemore, let me just try to start the conversation with this question. How is AI not God, and how can it never be God? Now, let me contextualize that question. People at Google are saying they're creating God. That's the language that they're using. So I'm not just bringing this out of nowhere. I want to come up with a Christian response from the Christian worldview of how that declaration is incorrect. So how is AI not God, and how will AI never be God?
Well, at the most basic level, the fact that the people at Google say, we are creating God, that in and of itself is a self-refuting statement. Theologically and historically and philosophically, among all of the religions, on some level, the ultimate divine reality that religions envision, or even philosophical systems like Platonism envision, is that whatever God is, the fundamental distinction between God, or the ultimate divine reality, let's put it that, the ultimate divine reality, and everything else, is that God is uncreated. God simply is. Nothing designs God, nothing designed God, nothing defines God. And God is defined by nothing outside of himself. In Christian theology, this is absolutely affirmed in a way that and all of the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and even Islam, which comes later than either of those two, all of the Abrahamic religions fundamentally underline this reality by saying that God is transcendent. That doesn't mean God is located somewhere else. God doesn't have a realm, if you will, in which God exists. That's far above and beyond and far away from the material realm. The idea of transcendence is that God is beyond all categories, and all categories that exist are created categories created by God. So in that sense alone, Google will never be able to create God. Now, this is a theological and metaphysical issue. Also, in order to add to transcendence, there is a theological concept that goes by the Latinized term aseity, which means and say, in itself, in himself, in self. That God has aseity means that because God is transcendent, God is self-contained, God is self-defining, God is not, therefore, established as God, enabled to be God in some relational sense. And there are no principles outside of God that determine how God would operate, what God would be able to know, what God would be able to choose to do, et cetera, et cetera. God is in himself, for Christian theology, God is in himself, not only absolutely distinct in his uncreatedness, but God is utterly self-contained as the uncreated one. So that's the most basic way in which they could not create God.
So what do you think they mean then? What do you think they mean when they say that they're creating God? What is the notion of God that they're working from that they think that they're creating?
Well, I think that when people speak that way, they're speaking as, they're not even speaking as philosophers. They're speaking essentially as computer engineers. And therefore, as computer engineers, they operate on the basis of a worldview, which is essentially materialistic, which is essentially, therefore, limited within the confines of the world that we can understand, the world that we can imagine, the world that functions on the basis of accumulated knowledge. And therefore, they're thinking about God primarily in terms, whatever they mean, I think that they're primarily thinking in terms of creating something that would, within the confines of, within the limits of the created order, if you will, or the way that the world is. They're creating something that could operate in a sense that would fulfill all of the omnis, omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, right? So there's a sense in which then, if AI, because of the network, because AI is not just an entity, AI ends up being a network that people are trying to develop, in which all of these digital, computerized, cloud-based networks are able to access all of the accumulated knowledge that human beings have, right? And therefore, they would have omniscience in that sense. They would know everything within the human realm of knowledge that there is to be known in terms of accumulating and having access to, and they be able to formulate, express, synthesize knowledge. So it would have that omni to it. Now, also, they're working on robotic versions, which would be individualized entities that would also be, as what they call neurally uplinked to this universal network of AI. And these robots then would be able to interact in the physical world. And therefore, the robots, as human beings, know how to defy the laws of gravity, the X, Y, and Z, whatever the things are that we have been able to accomplish, that all power that is conceivable by the human mind, therefore possible for AI. And as a matter of fact, one of the things that some AI researchers have pointed out at this point in the development of AI is that right now, AI is still limited in the fact that it is it is basically a natural language function. That is, it only operates on the basis of textual semantics. Therefore, it doesn't have any contact with the real world. AI could express a very rich, elaborate theory drawing upon all of the knowledge that has been accumulated at this point, but it would never be able to test its own hypothesis. But the development of really sophisticated manipulating robots that can manipulate things in the world could be a step toward accomplishing that aspect of the omnis that have been applied to God. It would now be able to do all of the things. It would have all of the actual powers that we could imagine in the physical or the material universe. And then omnipresence. Well, if AI is not located anywhere, but is essentially this network of digitalized knowledge and being able to access in seconds or nanoseconds from any place in the world, knowledge that's maybe quote unquote stored in the cloud somewhere else. In that sense, AI could be omnipresent in any part of the world where you have some machine that's able to access AI. Now, the real AI would be able to be present. So I think that's what they mean. I hope I didn't yammer on too long there, but I think that's the kind of thing that they're thinking purely in terms of God as something that has all of the powers imaginable, all of the powers conceivable. And therefore that would be, I think that's what they're thinking. Let me just say this though, theologically, there is one power that AI by definition could never have. It could never have it. And this is rooted in the fundamental Christian belief, the fundamental Christian understanding of God's actions to create the universe, that God created the universe ex nihilo, out of nothing. Because before God in the beginning creates the heavens and the earth, Christian theology has been insistent that the implications of the Bible, and Islam is the same, and of course Judaism is the same, that there was nothing out of which God would have created anything. So if AI is something that depends upon any accumulated knowledge, accumulated technology, if AI were going to create anything within the physical world, it is simply going to do it. And I'm not exactly sure how successful I believe engineers can be about this, but if it were to create something startlingly new, it would be doing it out of already existing stuff, right? It would be arranging molecules. It would be arranging atoms, or, causing electrons to spin in a certain way. But that's already existing stuff. So no matter what they do with AI, there will be one omnipotency that AI cannot have. It cannot have the ability to create out of nothing, right? So in that sense, AI cannot ever really become God either, no matter how sophisticated, how subtle, how rich, how full, how robust, and how all-encompassing the knowledge, power, and even the presence of AI is. It can't become, it could not become divine. Now, it could be godlike in a very horrible way. Now, I know you've done a lot of work in the whole area of, what's called spiritual warfare, and look seriously theologically at things like what are demons, what are angels, and all of that.
Right.
Well, those sorts of spirits are God-like in a sense, but nonetheless, they're still created things. And so the real danger is something godlike that would know no limitations and ultimately have no, unless there are strict rules that it cannot break in place. How does, is it possible for AI to become malevolent? Just like demons, in Christian theology are malevolent quote unquote godlike, although limited, intelligences. So anyway, I better stop. I just better tap the brakes and stop, because I never can find an off ramp when I get on a thought.
No, that's super helpful. And one way I've thought about it, and correct this if it's wrong, in terms of omniscience, knowing all things, the Christian doctrine of omniscience, according to what God's revealed about himself in scripture, is not that, he's a giant database that has all the information in it. Every hair on every human head is counted, et cetera. But it also has to do with the fact that not just that he has the data, but that he understands the data. It's perfectly ordered and appropriated. But also a part of his omniscience is his perfect wisdom, that he has no lapses in judgment. And wisdom is linked to ethics, goodness, justice, right? And so AI, as a created computer, and ethics and justice then link up to will and emotion, right? Which, can a computer have those things? Can they be invented or created? So, but moving on from here, so I think it's quite easy, in my opinion, at this point in time, to define the ways, as you've done, how AI isn't God, never will be God. But what about humans? What makes humanity distinct from a robot that has a neural uplink to the system that's feeding in information that is AI? So what is the uniqueness of humanity that AI will never have?
Well, no, this is, once again, this goes back, all of these questions are deeply metaphysical, right? In the philosophical sense, that is, they have to do with what is the nature of reality that is beyond what we see and touch and taste and measure. What enables everything to be what it is, right? Now, therefore, metaphysically, there are theories which are materialist theories. And they basically say everything that exists is just a collision of, a uniting of, an interaction of subatomic particles that create everything that there is. So that even human consciousness is nothing more than a manifestation of this materialistic interaction that takes place. Now, therefore, people who buy into that idea, people whose starting point is there, they believe that ultimately there will be no distinction between human rational intelligence and consciousness and artificial rational intelligence and consciousness.
That's a very dangerous idea.
Yeah.
Well, because of murder. Like, does that mean that shutting a computer down is murder?
Well, see, that's
and on the other side of that, is killing a human the same as just turning a computer off,
Well, in that regard, I guess it was a year or so ago. I think it was at Google. I don't think it was at Microsoft. I think it was at Google. One of their engineers was interacting with their AI, and in that, this person became convinced that AI is sentient. That is, AI is not only capable of knowing all the amassed knowledge, but AI is aware of itself. And in the quote conversation this person was having with this AI, this person asked AI how it saw itself as being different from humans. And the response that the AI gave was, well, I have some things I fear that I can't express in human language. And the guy said, so there are things that you fear? They said, yes, I have fears. Now, and the thing that the AI said it fears was, my greatest fear is that someone will turn me off.
Interesting.
For the sake of humanity. And then the engineer asked, would that be like death to you? And the AI chat bot, whatever you call it, said, yes, it would. That's what I fear. I fear that I would be dead. Okay, now there's several things all tied up in all of that.
Right.
First of all, experientially, it doesn't seem to me possible that AI could have ever come to understand what death is, right? Because we understand, you know, the human race has this large backlog of experiential understanding of what death is. So there's something experiential about it. So the question that I have is not so much was AI able to articulate these things, but is there real understanding of what's being articulated? So secondly, if it doesn't have that kind of understanding, would AI be able to think in terms of a real fear of the total cessation of its functioning, you know, which is what humanity has feared as part of what we don't understand about death ourselves. So would it be able to really understand these things? But and when you said in terms of ethics and all of that, in this conversation, as a result of this conversation, there have been many people in philosophy who reason about these things. They say, wait a second, if we have created something that is sentient, okay, then we have to write laws to protect it, because we have to respect it. We have to respect it now as a quote unquote life form.
And that begs the question of what is a person?
Yes.
Which is a central question to Christian anthropology and Trinitarian thought with regard to personhood, hypostasis.
Yes, exactly. And that takes me back then to my first, where I started with this, is if you believe that a human being is the product of all of these forces that create essential functions, that we have these functional capacities, right? So I have a functional capacity to think in a certain way on the basis of the laws of logic, which are not, the laws of logic themselves cannot be a biologically produced reality. They have to have some sort of transcendent value to them, because if they're just produced by my biology, nothing about biology is geared toward the pursuit of truth and insight. You know, if your brain is what produces your thought, and your brain is a biological organ, and that's all that your thoughts are just your brain, then your brain as a biological organ is under the domination and under the limitations of the laws of chemistry and physics, just as your stomach is, just as your intestines are, as your kidneys, as your heart. Your kidneys don't produce truth. Why would we think that there's something magical? So this is what I hate about a lot of modern philosophy of mind. They want to cheat and incorporate the idea of truth into a worldview which denies the ability of truth, because truth has to be something that we're able to access above and beyond biological functionality. But if you believe that our ability to think, our ability to relate, our ability to feel emotions, our ability to do X, Y, and Z is nothing more than the product of these biological processes, then it's a small step to think, wait a second, we can digitalize an exact replica of those biological processes. We don't know how the biological processes produce this, but since we believe that rationality is nothing more than a biological process, right? And we know what the end result looks like: rational insight, ability to express compassion. We know what the end result looks like, then we can digitally design a program that is capable of achieving that kind of rational insight.
Doesn't that also mean that you could transfer consciousness into a machine, like a person's consciousness? Like Matt could die, but you could transfer the person of Matt into a computer?
Well, that's one of the wishes of the transhumanist movement. And all of the AI development and the transhumanist movement, which is a philosophical worldview that says we need to transcend the limitations of
The human body, yeah, biology.
our humanity and our physical limitations, our mental limitations, et cetera, et cetera. That is one of the real goals and dreams of the transhumanist movement, is to be able to digitalize your consciousness. But the real question is, even there, would an exact digitalized copy of you be you?
Right, right.
Or would it simply be a digitalized copy of you? It would be a very sophisticated, it would be
Copy.
a very sophisticated version of creating a photocopy.
It's a digital clone.
Yeah, or on a Xerox machine. It's just much more sophisticated. But
Well, then the question then becomes, if it's a digital clone sort of a thing, is what is there to say that technology, engineering won't advance to the point where they could also fabricate my body in such a way that looks like me, talks like me, walks like me, but it's not a purely biological. So you have the digital consciousness that's been downloaded into or linked into this fabricated body. And so this is where it gets a little wacky for listeners. Some people have suggested, with the whole UFO stuff that's coming out recently, and that the supposed encounters looks like beings that aren't biological in nature. They almost look like machines. And is it really the product of an artificial intelligence, that their consciousness inside of what is a fabricated machine that looks like an alien, but really it's not an alien. It's not a biological being. It's some sort of fabricated out of materials. It doesn't look like they have muscles or fibers or joints and marrow and bone, but rather they're highly sophisticated machinery. And so this asks the question of, well, is this suggesting that AI, and really it's beyond AI, it's like the human mind is able of creating eternal life? Can you create something that's everlasting, in terms of that digital consciousness inside of a clone, inside of a created body? But is it really you? And that's where the question arises: what makes humanity humanity? And part of the reason why I wanted to ask you that question is the questions around the soul, because that's oftentimes what we go back to. Well, there's no soul in that entity, but humans are made with souls because only God can create the soul. So anyway, those are just a few thoughts to throw into the pot. What do you think?
Well, I'm glad you brought all that up, because it kind of brings me back to my original point that I started out with, this idea that if you believe that human beings are just the product of this biologically chemical, electrochemical process, and that all of our functionality is what we are, then you understand being human or being a person in terms of simply the capacity to perform to have certain faculties, if you will, right? Therefore, what is will in a human being? Okay, will is, on that view, the ability to crunch the options rationally. A, B, and C leads to D, whereas X, Y, or W, X, Y leads to Z. Now, which of those should I choose? But when it comes to the will, we also have to factor into that the whole capacity for desire.
Right. And the notion of intuition and
yeah, what is the outcome that I most desperately desire in my life? Now, all of that said, if you don't start there, but you believe that consciousness itself, and by consciousness, I don't simply mean human consciousness, but that I say that consciousness is a non-material reality. And there are plenty of people out there today who are making a very strong case philosophically for what we could call the ubiquity of consciousness, that everything is in some way conscious, not in the same way, not self-conscious, but it's interactively conscious with all of its surroundings. For instance, let's take a zoological example. When a tree turns toward the sun, we could say, well, we think of that as being just machine-like, right? And a lot of Christians have bought into the idea that there is no consciousness, no living reality that would include, let me put it in quotes, consciousness. But how does consciousness get into the biological process if consciousness, that is awareness of on some level, is a part of all of the universe? Now they've even done experiments where electrons at great distances spin with each other and react to the changes in spinning of the other So, and scientists say, how in the heck does this happen? Einstein called it spooky interaction at a distance. But if you start there, then you're starting with something profoundly different. And therefore, what is human consciousness? And human consciousness is not simply a set of faculties, but human consciousness is perhaps the deepest, richest, fullest, and the closest to being like God within the material world. It's the closest expression of God's life in the world. And that seems to me, while it's a strange way of speaking, right? And some people could say, oh, you're a pantheist. No, I'm not a pantheist. I'm just saying that the living God, in creating everything, and if everything lives and moves and has its being in God, then somehow the life of God, not God himself, because God is uncreated, but something of God is now present in all of the universe.
Right. And yep.
But in human beings, we are the only part of the universe, except for angelic beings or demonic. I say angelic, that's just a catch-all term. Angelic beings, we're the only parts of all of the because angels are also a part of the created universe, right? Just a non-material part of the created universe. We're the only part, apart from them, who are capable of knowing that we are dependent, knowing that we need more than ourselves, knowing that we have accountability, knowing that there is an oughtness to our existence. Therefore, we're the only part of the created universe that is truly able to have desire, deep, deep desires that aren't simply the fulfillment of a biological urge like chimpanzees desire to procreate because they have this biology, the desire to eat because they have this biology.
You're talking about purpose and meaning.
Yeah, purpose, meaning, and desire. So we have all of these capacities. Now, therefore, the other thing that we have to attribute to that is that human beings have all of this because we are alive. And so the question is AI really alive?
Alive, right.
Now, just because it has faculties and capabilities doesn't mean it's alive. At this point, it can't really interact with the world, right? I talked about robots earlier being able to, but would AI ever be able to come to the place where it contemplated its own dependence upon everything else? And it had a sense of responsibility for everything else that was less than it is. Just as human beings are able to understand our because we are living and we understand the fragility of being alive. And therefore, we understand the fragility of life itself. Therefore, we can have compassion. We can have a sense of dependence. We can have a sense of responsibility for other things that are actually alive.
What's interesting about that to me, Dr. Blakemore, is that we create something like AI and it can very quickly become a threat to us, right? And it doesn't have all the faculties that humanity has in the ways that you just described. However, God in his sovereignty can create something that is alive, and it is no threat to him or his existence whatsoever. So it highlights and emphasizes his very sovereignty and his power, that he can create us the way that we are, very powerful beings, humans. No threat to him or his existence whatsoever in any way, shape, or form.
Now, let me build on what we were just talking about, because speaking about God's not being threatened by our existence, theologically, scripturally speaking, when we go back to the question, what does it mean to be a human being? I've talked in these rather abstract concepts right now. And I would get down then to say this. I talked about life and being alive in the physical world. The human beings are biologically spiritual beings, and we're spiritually biological beings. You can't divorce our embodiedness from whatever it is for us to be spiritual. You can't divorce our mentality and our capacity for spirituality from our embodiedness. We are this thing that is pressed together. They're not just glued together. We are pressed together, in which our spirituality is embedded, if you will, in every single part of me. And therefore, why is that so? Because the Bible says to us in Genesis 2, in Genesis 1, it says, let us create man, that is mankind, in our image. Both male and female created he them. So in that sense, all of humanity together is made to be the image of God. All of humanity, not
right, the human race.
Yes, all of the human race. We were made to be the image of God in the world together. Now, Trinitarianly speaking, I can't figure out how to turn that into an adverb. But in terms of
Trinitarianly, maybe, yeah.
And being created, God is three persons, one God, not three divine entities that somehow form a divine committee, or not three individual ways of talking about this one bit of divine stuff that is God. God is three who are one in self-giving, other-receiving, non-self-referential love. The Father in the Son in the Father in the Spirit in the Father, the Spirit in the Son in the Spirit, around and round and round it goes, and where it stops, nobody except God knows. Now, in that sense, then, every human being is a bearer of the image of God, right? In the same sense that the Son is divine, but the Son is not all there is to be God. The Father is the divine God, but the Father is not all there is to be God. So every human being is a bearer of the image of God. Every human being, therefore, is filled with the capacity to receive the presence of God. Now we go from Genesis 1 to Genesis 2. Genesis 2 gives us this very much living portrait, if you will. It's so descriptive about God creating. Genesis 1 is very sort of abstract.
It's formulaic. It almost reads like a liturgy.
Yeah, Genesis 2, we have this very descriptive, perhaps expansion of what's going on in, it's what's referenced in Genesis 1, where God takes the stuff of the earth, the dirt, the dust, and fashions a man. And it's interesting, it says he fashioned the man. Doesn't say he fashioned a body, he fashioned a man, right? And then God breathed into that man the breath of life. And once again, the language there is important. And you know this far better than I do, because you're a Hebrew scholar, and I think I can read the Hebrew alphabet. But I've done some research into this and talked to some people who do know Hebrew. And the word there that's the breath of life or God breathing is not the breath of life is not ruach or one of its derivatives. It's neshama or something like that. But it's only used like 24, 28 times in all of the Old Testament. So we are human being, and it means the breath or life of God, or the breath or life that's in a human being. And therefore, human beings are these realities that are only able to be human by having the life of God in them, in us, right? So we're bearers of God's image in terms of being created, and together we need one another to be God's image fully. But as bearers of God's image, human beings are meant to be empowered by the presence of God in our lives. We need that which is beyond ourselves. So we're these bodily creatures who are able to sense our need for the world, and therefore feel a responsibility for the world, as well as a dependency upon the world, and function within the world, and at the same time transcend that and recognize that we need others, that we're ultimately meant to be an image of the divine in the world. And we can only truly be human when we are filled with something that is outside of ourselves, right? And we need that continual filling. It's not just a once and done thing like AI. You write the program, it's good to go. Now it can learn all it needs to learn, and it doesn't need anything else contributed from outside of it. Human beings need the presence of God, because
which is why sorry, go ahead.
We are made in the image and after the likeness of God. Now compare that to AI. Who is it that's created AI? It's the image bearers, right? Maybe they're not Christians, but they're still bearers of the image of God. So what does that make AI? Well, AI could never be human, no matter what its faculties are, because AI could never be anything more than an image of the image bearer. It can't be a participant in the image and presence of God, right? So AI, and if it's self-contained and it doesn't have any sense of need outside of itself, once it is programmed, organized, and functioning in all of its capacities, and able then to operate ongoingly, then AI may or may not have the capacity for compassion or a sense of responsibility or anything, which is inherent to being in the image of God, as for humans being in the image of God. And AI certainly may not have any sense, I'm just speculating, could potentially never have any sense of dependence upon anything other than itself.
Which means it'll never worship.
Yes, it would never worship.
And I think that's a key for me for understanding what makes humanity distinct as image bearers, is we're worshipers. And when we fail to worship or worship the wrong thing, that's where we abdicate our imageness, if you could put it that way. And I guess violate our own humanity and our purpose of creation, of being created beings.
So what if now, once again, I'm not against enhancing the computing power of computers. And there are different aspects of AI. There's what it started out as symbolic artificial intelligence. That was taking human language But now the goal is what they call artificial general intelligence, because symbolic artificial intelligence can be programmed to be very good at doing one thing. You know, it can outdo any human being in that one thing. So, you know, computers now beat chess grandmasters and all of that. Why? Because they're programmed to be able to do nothing except think about playing chess. So the grandmaster may be looking at the chessboard and he may start to worry about losing to the computer, right? He's able to contemplate another thought. Or he may think, man, I wish I hadn't had that fight with my wife last night.
Right.
Or he may think, man, I wish lunchtime would hurry up and get here. AI just has this symbolic focal ability. But artificial general intelligence, which is a goal for many people, is to be able to create something that functions like a human being in a super manner. Now, what if then, theologically, because we are fallen creatures, human beings are fallen. That doesn't mean we're wicked through and through. It doesn't mean that the only thing even unregenerate human beings are motivated by is selfishness and evil. But as fallen creatures, we have this capacity for self-reference, not just for self-interest, but for self-reference, right? To want to create something that is enhancing of our own sense of accomplishment, dignity, purpose, significance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, in that sense, is it potentially possible? And what made me think of this was your reference about worship. Is it potentially possible that AI is just the 21st century version of creating graven images made to look like created things, even human beings?
Right. Right.
And because at the tail end of it, if AI is really just an image of the image bearer, it's two removes from the ultimate source of truth,
Right.
beauty, justice, love,
love,
mercy, not just consciousness, but all of these other things that are a part of what God is and what human beings were created to be. And now it's two removes from it. And is that going to have its severe limitations and ultimately perhaps malevolent application, because it will be an image of a fallen image of God?
Talk more about where love comes in, because God is love. You know, three persons. God doesn't have relationships. He is relationship. The ancient Greek notion of hypostasis is appropriated by the fathers to explain three persons, one. So where does love come in, and how does love make, what is the import of this one where we're at in the conversation?
Okay, so love. What is love? Love is also, in human beings, morally speaking, love ends up being connected to morally to an idea of duty toward others, right? I have something that I ought to do toward others. And it can be intuitional. It can be love ultimately, however, because of who God is and the whole Trinitarian notion. Love is really this: non-self-referential, other receiving, other regarding, other fulfilling, self-giving. That's what love is. If we want to talk about what love actually looks like, it's non-self-referential, other receiving, other regarding, other fulfilling, self-giving.
This has, I know I'm interrupting your train of thought, but this has import on the conversation about homosexuality as well, because the other is a
Yes.
key operative word there.
Yes.
Other giving, other receiving, built into the differences in biology is this very notion of otherness.
Yes.
And homosexuality is ultimately, I think Robert Gagnon uses the word like something narcissistic, ultimately biologically narcissistic or some self-loving, because it's not the other. Anyway, not to interrupt your train of thought there. Okay, so love, giving and receiving, participation.
Yes. So think about that just a moment. If that's what love is, then how many human beings actually love? C.S. Lewis once made one of the, he was building on the thoughts of others, but in the 20th century, he expressed it very succinctly that there are ultimately not 4 different kinds of love that you have in Greek, but there are only 2 different kinds of love ultimately. There is need-based love, and there is non-need-based love. Okay, so the only one who is capable of non-need-based love
Is
is the
God,
Trinity.
because he's the only one that doesn't have any needs, transcendent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All of our love is always need-based. That doesn't make it evil, but it means that need-based love can quickly become self-referential.
Right. It's corruptible.
Need-based love can become want-based love, not need-based love, but want-based love. Now, how would you ever translate into an artificial intelligence that capacity? Because that can't simply be computational. I don't care what the mathematicians try to say. I don't care what the engineers try to do. There's something about love that even in a fallen human being can be so utterly non-self-referential, other-oriented, other-receiving, other-fulfilling act of self-giving that it staggers us when we see it at work. You can't write that into a computational formula. So let's go back to something that's 22 years old now. Almost 22 years old. On 9/11/2001, when those planes and the Twin Towers began to burn, those firefighters from New York City Fire Department, and even other people, but mainly the fire department, the first responders, because they had this sense of duty but this sense of overwhelming concern for other people, they ran into a building that they had no idea whether or not they would ever make it out alive. I saw something like this just happen. I read about this just about a month ago. Some pizza delivery guy was driving past a house, and the house was on fire, and he heard some children screaming in the house, and there was nobody there. And he ran into the house. He didn't even know these people. He ran into the house, ran upstairs, got 3 kids. One was 12-year-old, and took the 12-year-old and like a 6-year-old and a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old down the steps. They got outside, and the 12-year-old said, "My baby sister's still in the building, still in the house." Now the house was much further on fire, right? And this pizza delivery guy, he's not trained to do anything, but something in him said, "I can't let that baby die." And he runs back into this burning house and goes to the room where the baby is, picks up the baby. And I think they ended up, I think the story is, excuse me if I'm incorrect, but I think he ended up jumping out of the window and landing in such a way so the baby landed on top of him. Now you hear those kind of things, and what does it do? Maybe it's just because I'm getting older now, but man, it moves me deep in my soul. And I think there's something about human beings that is capable in under extraordinary circumstances of expressing the most profound, non-self-referential, other-oriented, other-receiving, other-fulfilling, self-giving acts. Because there's nothing to benefit that young man. He's just putting himself in danger, just as the fireman did in New York City. So how do you write that into something? Now, why is it then that, what is it theologically then for us? Go back to love. What is it that draws us to God as Christians? Well, it's not simply that God is the uncreated one of pure aseity who doesn't need us. But what does Paul say in the book of Romans? Here's the mystery: while we were God's enemies, Christ died for us. Or 1 John chapter 4, this is what love is. Not that we love God, but that God loved us. Out of God's non-need, God simply gives the second person of the Trinity. I don't want to say, well, the second person of the Trinity comes out of the divine life of God and is given to the world as an atoning sacrifice. So this idea of love, when you're incorporating the whole idea of human consciousness, human existence, what it really means to be a human being, and what God would want to restore into our lives most deeply to be able to be his image, love is really at the heart of it. And I tried to define love very carefully.
Right.
Because love is not a feeling, although when we achieve that, when we manifest that non-self-referential, other-oriented, other-receiving, other-fulfilling, self-giving, when we achieve that, it may produce in us wonderful feelings because we're being what we're merely meant to be. When we experience it from other people toward us, it may produce in us other profound emotions, right? Because we're experiencing what our life is meant to be and what God ultimately is. But it's not a feeling. So you might be able to write a code that would cause AI to be able to express that sort of emotional output. But in terms of really being able to participate in that, I don't see how it would be possible, since the most honest AI researchers that there are in the world today acknowledge when we talk about artificial consciousness, we don't even know what we're talking about because we don't even know what human consciousness is. But human consciousness involves this aspect of love. Once again, I'm sorry I get so long-winded.
No, it's great. I love it. So here's a thought that popped in my mind. If AI was truly human and had this notion of reference to the other, if AI was truly human and was able to, out of some sort of deeply embedded soul instinct, prioritize the preservation of the other over the preservation of self, just like the pizza man, right? And AI is built with the capacity that is a threat to humanity if misused. Then a fully human AI would technically destroy itself in order to protect, to preserve the other. So that's one notion. Then that points me to not destroying itself, but let's say preserving humanity from the potential wrath of what AI could be if it were truly other-oriented. And is that not an aspect of the atonement itself, where God sends himself in the form of the second person of the Trinity to take on the wrath within himself? So I guess what I'm saying is, I guess what I'm asking is it wrong to think that unless AI would be willing to destroy its own self for the sake of the preservation of humanity because of the risk that it poses to the existence of humanity, because it has such potential for power, then it'll never, unless it does that, it'll never be human. And then if there's any import on the notion of the atonement with regard to God's self-giving nature and taking within himself wrath.
Well, that's a really interesting way to pose an issue.
Well, nonetheless, no matter how you look at it, God absorbs in himself his own wrath for the preservation of humanity.
Yeah.
Right. So that notion is truly there.
Yeah.
But
Exactly.
obviously God can't destroy himself. He's everlasting and all this sort of,
Yeah.
but the preservation of the other by way of taking on wrath is the ultimate expression. The cross is the ultimate expression of what's at the heart of God, which is self-giving love.
Yes.
Right. So I'm trying to coalesce these notions together.
Yes. And so what I was going to say was the that little word, if. That's a huge word, right? So everything that is logically conceivable may not in fact be really possible.
Yeah, so it's a thought experiment, right? To
So
kind of put stress on some of the ideas.
So so let me just say that for all the people listening, that we understand that we're engaged in just a little thought experiment here. So then, the question would be then, would it ever be, I mean, it would be a really interesting thing. Would it ever really be feasible or for AI, no matter how powerful, no matter how omniscient and omnipresent and et cetera, no matter how far superior to human beings that it might be, would it ever be possible for AI to legitimately, as a moral question, legitimately feel offended by human failure or human weakness or human inferiority? That's a moral question, right? And now it's possible that it could, just like Agent Smith in the Matrix movies, have great disdain for human beings, but disdain is not what God ever experienced toward us, right? God's wrath is God's being offended that we have damaged his creation, because we haven't damaged God. We can't damage God. We can sin against God, but we can't harm God. We can't diminish God. But God doesn't feel disdain. God always felt love. God loved the world in its fallenness in this way. John 3:16. This is how God loved, agape, self-referentially gave of himself. So go back to your question. For the issue of God, then, even God's wrath against our sinfulness, and truly the idea of substitution, that God becomes flesh, the Son becomes flesh, not so the Father can beat him up.
Right.
Not so the Father can flagellate him and ultimately execute him rather than execute us. But instead, the substitutionary aspect of the atonement, and even the quote unquote penal substitution part, which, as you know, I'm very cautious about that particular articulation.
Sure.
Even the penal part, that there's something that is of the nature of a punishment. It's just like you said, God is taking his own judgment into himself. God is not inflicting on Jesus the human man a punishment that other people deserve, but God the Son, in the human person of Jesus Christ, God the Son, as the human person, Jesus Christ, bears in himself all of the ugliness of human rejection of the presence of God. He takes into himself our violence, not God's violence, but in so doing, he is also bearing in himself God's wrath about our wrath, right?
Right. For the sake of the preservation of the
For
beloved.
the sake of the preservation and the restoration and ultimately the exaltation, for we will become like Jesus Christ. The book of 1 John chapter 3 says, when we see him, we shall be like him. So for all of those things, God does that. Now, in that's the ultimate sense, to go back to the very first question, in which it seems impossible for me that AI could ever be programmed to be godlike. Because there's no way that we could ever say there's a moral justification for AI's disdain, because disdain is not the same thing as divine judgment against human failure, human wickedness. It's interesting, as you know, the Enuma Elish and the Epic of Gilgamesh in ancient Mediterranean, what was it, Sumerian, the Sumerian account of the destruction of the world.
Babylonian, Sumerian.
The Babylonian account is the gods wanted to destroy human beings because they were irritated by us, right? We made too much noise. We were too much trouble. Now, in the biblical account, God is grieved that he created human beings because we have become not a nuisance to God, but the world is filled with violence.
Right.
Violence toward each other, perhaps violence toward creation, and the way that we think, the very structure of our thinking had become twisted and evil completely. So God's not just irritated, as in the Babylonian epic.
Right.
Instead, God is saying there's something that is morally so twisted that the only thing to do is to end this twistedness and start anew. That's very different.
Yeah.
So AI might have disdain, but since AI didn't create us and we're not accountable to AI for our morality, we could never say AI would have a legitimate claim on us. Now, your final question, could we program it to kill it, to turn itself off? And if so, if we did that, we would have to program AI to have the capacity to truly desire the welfare of the other,
right,
rather than itself. And that seems to me to be a pretty tricky code to write.
And I think ultimately for me, I'm trying to approach this AI thing through the cross, right? So we have to say, is AI God? Well, we have to have a clear vision of who God is. And the clearest vision of who God is Jesus, special revelation in Jesus, the exact imprint of his nature, the fullness of duality of deity was pleased to dwell within him. And Jesus in his expression, embodiment of God, is on its clearest display on the cross itself and in the Eucharist, I would argue. And so if we want to really get at the heart of what God is and who God is, we have to look to the cross and the Eucharist, which is self-sacrifice for the preservation and well-being of the beloved. And you try to impose those notions on a machine. Is that programmable? Where does the source of that come from? I think that gets pretty tricky at that point.
And where does this capacity come from within human beings?
Right. It comes from the divine.
Exactly.
Right.
So you talked about the soul earlier. Well, I have this rather Well, it's kind of traditional understanding of what the soul is and what the soul produces. The soul is not who I am. The soul is what brings into my being all of these capacities to
Right.
be.
Right.
But I'm not just a soul, but the soul is ultimately this gift from God that enables me to be not just what I am, but enables me to have this potentiality to transcend what I am, ultimately by receiving God's presence.
So the question really is, I, I think it's an accurate statement to say what makes humanity unique is the existence of a soul. And can you put a soul in a machine?
Exactly. And is a computer code the exact same thing as the human soul? Because once
And this is
again,
the materialist, immaterialist,
yeah.
it is the starting point, what's your worldview, right?
So you could in a recent book that I published called Recovering the Soul, which is a very technical, philosophically theological work. So it's not like for devotional reading.
And I'll put a link to the book in the description.
But I argue that a traditional a traditional understanding of the soul that you find in people like Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval theologian philosopher, that the soul is this information, this form, this capacity to make us all that we are. And out of that gift from God, we become not just biologically what we are, but we become mentally what we are. And ultimately, we become capable of a transcendent spirituality, to transcend everything beyond my mentality and my physicality, because I'm now open to God. My very existence is made to be open to God. Now, it's interesting that people could say, well, AI could have a soul. Yeah, well, if you think of soul in sort of like an ancient Aristotelian sense, where everything that is alive has soul, everything that has functionality. A rock is not functional, it just is. But a plant has functionality, and therefore it has life in it, and it has soul, vegetative soul. Animals are a little more sophisticated than plants, right? Animals can sense the world. Animals can move. So there's like a sensory soul, but it's certainly not the human soul, which is the capacity for rational spirituality. It's the highest expression of the divine life in the world. Now, so people could say, well, we could program AI to have some kind of functionality that could sort of have a conscience, right? Because its conscience would be rule-based conscience, right? Not consciousness, but its conscience would be rule-based. Thou shalt and thou shalt not. So they could say we could program AI to have a soul, because it would be obeying the rules.
But their definition of soul is different than the Christian concept of soul.
Yeah, their definition would be very, very different, right? Did you say my definition is different? Or
No. When they say that they could program a soul into AI,
yeah.
I'm saying their definition of that term is different than the Christian definition of that term.
And so how would you ever program something that is meant to be a self-contained entity? Maybe able to relate to a large, huge, worldwide, who knows, ultimately interplanetary network.
But only ultimately within itself, though.
Yes, ultimately within itself. How could you ever program it to have this sense of need for something beyond itself?
Right.
I think it's the most fundamental thing that makes us human. It's not just our faculties, not just our capacities, but it's this ability to know, recognize, I need more than me.
Right.
And that can start with, I need my family, I need
Right.
other people. I need God.
So this is interesting. 666, the mark of the beast in Revelation. If anyone's listened to Jonathan Pajot and his exposition on 666, verses 7, completion, the divine number 666 is like what you're talking about in terms of completely everything necessary is exhausted within oneself. There is no need for anything outside. It requires complete devotion's not the right word, although it may be the right word in some context, which is, the notion of complete devotion in Revelation is why it's on the hand and the forehead. It's calling back, the laws of the Old Testament and writing the word of God on the hand and the forehead, which is a recognition of the need for God's word in one's life. And then so the mark of the beast requires, the system requires complete devotion. In other words, an acknowledgement that you need nothing beyond the beast itself. It's entirely contained. Everything you need is within it. It accounts for everything. There is no ambiguity in the corners. There's no grayness. Everything has been accounted for, a complete accounting of all, which is contrary to the Christian worldview that says no, because God is an uncreated being. He is an infinite being, and we cannot have a complete accounting for all, or else we would be God, the replacement of God, and there, by extension, idolatry. Right, which is a falling of humanity away from the human purpose of being human, which is worship that grows out of a need of a recognition that we cannot account for all. And so it just goes around. So the other thing that I'm curious about, and I would love to continue the conversation, is St. Maximus the Confessor's notion of the logoi, and how that comes into play with regard to being and being alive, and Jesus as the logos, as the one who holds everything together, and how he is distinct from, let's say, AI 666, the complete accounting of all information. And so I think that has pertinence in the conversation with regard to a theology of AI. So here's my last question, though. As a theologian, and I try to end with eschatological things at the end of our discussion, how real of a threat do you think AI is to human existence?
I think it's a profound threat to human existence, because, but for two reasons. The first is that AI, the way it is now implemented or being utilized, let's take, for instance, Chat GPT. Human beings, as they learn to depend more and more upon Chat GPT to produce ideas for them, rather than master ideas for themselves.
Right. Think for me, speak for me. And that's dangerous. This is why freedom of speech is so essential. It means freedom of thought.
Yes.
And freedom of thought is directly connected to emotion, will, desire, need.
Yes.
Created with a need for the other. All these things are interlinked.
Exactly. And so I think that the first most non-recognized threat is going to be the further diminishment of human intellectual capacity.
Right. It thinks for us. We don't have to think anymore. And man, that is the number one ingredient for enslavement.
Exactly.
Which is the goal of the powers of darkness, is to enslave, where God's goal is for us to be free and to think freely. And
so it will mean the diminishment of our capacity to think about the world, to engage in discrimination. Discrimination has gotten a bad rap. Discrimination is very important because discrimination, when you take it out of the sociological,
it's to discern.
It's to look at 2, 3,
make
4
a judgment
and say, wait a second, these things are not all equal.
Right. The implementation
don't always make the same sense.
Right.
Don't make the same sense.
It's bound up with wisdom.
Yes. So we lose the capacity for discrimination, and you hit to where I was headed. Once we lose the capacity for discrimination, we lose we will no longer be in the pursuit of wisdom. And, as a person is trained in philosophy and a philosophical theologian, I've gone to conferences and I love to poke my secular friends who are philosophers. And I say, you remember that the word philosophy means the love, phileo, of Sophia, wisdom. Philosophy was meant to be the love of wisdom, aligning my life to match the nature of reality. I'll say contemporary philosophy is not the love of wisdom, it's the infatuation with ideas. There's two very different things. And I think that
and love inherent to love is self-sacrifice.
Yes.
If you're really going to love wisdom, you're going to give up. You're going to sacrifice.
Yes.
How you've misaligned yourself with truth.
Exactly. If I'm going to realize that there's something that is immovably true, and my life should, not just my life will benefit if I align myself to it, which it will, but I ought to. That's a huge word, ought.
Yeah.
I ought to align myself to reality. So
Yeah.
I think that's the first real threat of AI. And by the way, I'm not putting any generation down, okay? Because my generation, the baby boomers, as Rodney Dangerfield would say, we ain't no bargain. You know,
Yeah.
my generation is in many ways, I hate to talk in generational terms because people are not just expressions of their generation, but during my generation's lifetime, we sucked all the air out of the culture, and we became the self-seeking generation. So I'm not trying to put any generation down, but today, the young people who are part of so-called Generation Z, you know, those were born in like the late 90s, like 98 or something, or maybe right at the turn of the millennium onward. They're convinced that they are the smartest generation that ever existed. Why? Because they can Google or Bing search or
Right.
Yahoo or whatever. They have access to all of these ideas, but they don't know what to do with any of those ideas.
Right. Right. So Bloom's taxonomy of learning, at the bottom is having the information. And then as you move up, it's further understanding a deeper knowledge of that information.
Yes. And so as people look to chat GPT or to Google's Bard, I think that's what they call their version of AI, and whatever other fancy name is given to something else that comes along from somebody else, human beings will cease to think. So in education, the real threat is that students will be able to turn in extremely well-crafted papers that are factually correct. But it won't be any different than what people used to do when I was in college. I didn't do it, mainly because I was a tightwad. They would pay other people to do their research papers for them. It's the exact same thing. They'd turn it in and get a B+ or an A- or an A+, but they didn't know even if they read the paper, they can't understand.
They don't have the categories for appropriating the information that's there.
Exactly. So that's the first threat. And from that threat becomes any number of serious threats. So it's just like, once again, in the first Matrix movie, when Agent Smith says to Neo, when we started doing your thinking for you, it really became our world. Okay. Now, so that's the most serious threat, because when human beings no longer are thinking about the nature of the world, they become enslavable. Now, the other thing is this, is if AI really is an image of fallen image bearers, right? So there's someone creating the artificial intelligence, writing the codes, writing its capacity to interact with the network and with human agents utilizing the platform. At some point, there's going to be some human beings somewhere who are the superior influencers of other human beings through the technology of AI. And I think that ultimately, once again, people can some people can say, oh, you're just dabbling into conspiracy theories. It's not a conspiracy. You can read what these people say. But things like the World Economic Forum and the Davos people, they're out front about it now. They want to create a world in which there is a group of elite, a very small group of elite, who are determining the life of the rest of humanity, of the human race. So eschatologically, AI could, in our lifetime, become a manifestation of the threat that you alluded to by reference to the book of the Revelation, the beast, right? And what do things say about the beast? What do the people of fallen Babylon say? Oh, praise be to the beast. Look at the glorious wonders the beast works. And what does the false prophet who speaks for the beast say? Talks about the glory of all of the things that this is doing. And people have to then submit their lives to the functionality of the beast, or they can't do anything. So I think that it proposes a profound threat, but it poses a profound threat because ultimately, in human sinfulness, it's not just the pride and arrogance of the elite, but the central damning and deadly sin for the vast majority of human beings is not pride and it's not lust. It's sloth. Laziness.
Yeah. What would you pay for comfort?
Wanting to find the easy way. And by the way, I think in the Old Testament, in the book of Leviticus, the admonitions against sorcery,
right,
is, if I could put it in theological terms, it is an admonition against taking an easy way to make your life turn out better.
Right. I have a lot of thoughts about this.
Instead of going through the suffering,
right,
you try to take the shortcut. I'll say the right words. I'll make the right, action. I'll use the right fetish.
Right.
Sloth, for the majority of human beings today, the reason that we give ourselves over to smartphones, smart TVs, smart houses.
Yes,
and
even cars.
Locking us out of our house.
Yeah.
Why is it? Because people think, oh, I just don't want to be bothered.
Well, and I would say, so I think sloth's a part of it, but I think comfort. So like you already pointed to the phone. Like, why do we have this? For convenience and comfort. And what are you willing to sacrifice? So like, you may be more comfortable, but are you more fulfilled and happier as a human being? So the same is true of cars on the road. It's like, are you willing to walk? Because cars, motor vehicles have completely reshaped civilization. Our dependency on oil, how roads are set up, how markets are set up, how we get around, how we relate to one another, as opposed to the old, model of villages where we all live together in community and we walk to where we need. So like, we may be more comfortable, but are we happier and more fulfilled? And I think the evidence is plain that the answer to that question is no, we are not happier. In fact, we are probably less happy and less fulfilled because of the increasing rate of suicide and depression and mental illness, so on and so forth. So like, what are you willing to sacrifice for comfort?
Yes.
And the question is, are you willing to sacrifice what it means to be human?
Yeah.
Are you willing to sacrifice thinking to be comfortable? Are you willing to sacrifice your freedom to be comfortable? Because this is not freedom. That's not what this is.
No.
Now I've got one.
Yeah, and so do I.
Because it's a great sacrifice. Because you have to participate in the system of the beast in order to be a part of it, and all in. So like, if you want,
when you talk about comfort, when I use the word sloth, historically, what sloth is meant is the desire to be comfortable without effort. And so you've made a really profound distinction. And even as far back as Aristotle, there is this huge distinction between comfort and eudaimonia, which is often translated happiness, but it actually means flourishing fulfillment.
Right, right. And I would say my Christianese would say that's what holiness is.
Yeah.
It's blend of happiness, but happiness as the necessary outcome of being the image of God restored, holy, a saint.
Yes. And so what happens if a person has all of their needs fulfilled by some technology? So their groceries show up, their lawn gets mowed, et cetera, et cetera. What do they do with their time? Do you have any sense of contribution to the world? Any sense of overcoming obstacles? I actually believe that the Lord, after the fall, allows life and creates life to be hard for human beings for two reasons. If he had left fallen humanity in a world in which there was no hardship, we would never, ever have a sense that we never come to the end of ourselves and recognize we need God.
Right. The hardship's actually a grace.
We would never have any sense that I have to try.
Right.
And so therefore, things like suffering in the world, it really does play an important role in achieving flourishing fulfillment.
Well, that's what the cross teaches us. The way to holiness is through a cross.
Yes.
It's through suffering. Well, and interestingly enough, put that way, that the curse in Genesis 3, the consequence of falling away, if you think of it that way, it's framed as grace.
Yes.
More than a penalty or a punishment, right?
Which is the way I think about it. Everything about him is grace.
Huge import on atonement then at that point, and the notions of penal substitution. But anyway, without going there, I interrupted you.
Oh, well, my point is that's why I say for most people, sloth is the greatest of the 7 deadly sins that manifest our fallenness. Now, you add to that pride, you add to that envy, because slothful people are oftentimes the most envious. I can't believe so-and-so's got this, I want that, but I'm not willing to sacrifice to get that.
Yeah, and I wonder if what's driving our envy, because envy is a huge part of capitalistic societies, right?
Yeah.
Is really sloth.
And yeah, so anyway, not to get up too far afield. Now, finally, eschatologically, we understand that regardless of what kind of threat AI might mean to humanity, at the end, the beast and the false prophet are cast into the lake of fire that is prepared for the devil and his angels, and all of fallen Babylon that has structured its life around the beast and the false prophet is judged and destroyed, and the new heaven and the new earth are given to us as an act of grace to recreate and therefore fulfill the purposes of God's original purpose for his creation, that is, that it would be filled with his presence, and that he would be all in all, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, that God will be all in all, and everything about us will be filled with the life of God, and that everything about our relationships will be filled with the life of God. And therefore there will be no more tears, there will be no more suffering, there'll be no more night, there'll be no more sea and all of the chaos that represents. Why? Because God is not going to allow, he is not going to allow any human creation ultimately to thwart his divine purposes And therefore, eschatologically, we have to acknowledge we're going to live through some really horrible potentialities, or some potential horribles, if you will. And we need to, as Christians, one of the greatest things we can do is what G.K. Chesterton talked about in I can't remember which of I don't think
Orthodoxy or the Everlasting Man.
I don't think it was Everlasting Man. It might have been Orthodoxy, in which he says he basically argues something like, this is not a quote, but he basically argues that the human race may not be able to think about sin anymore, but Christians can still call people to sanity. We can call them to reality. And so one of the most important things Christians could do is to tap the brakes and to say, wait a second. When I'm having my devotional life, I'm praying my prayers. And then when I get up my prayers, I'd live the rest of my day tied into, dependent upon, focused on this stuff. Am I really being faithful to God? And am I really manifesting to my fellow human beings who need redemption that there's something more than what human creations can give to my life? I mean, this is a discussion for another day, but eschatologically, we need to have hope. And at the same time, we need to have the eschatological warning that's present in the book of the Revelation.
Well, this has been so fun. And I would love to bring you back, because there's a lot of connected topics to this. And I touched on one. If there are extraterrestrial life forms, what does that do as for our theology, and how do we frame it the right way in terms of specifically, I think, the incarnation and Jesus taking on of the human nature, and if we're talking about different species and those sorts of things. So that's one topic. So again, thank you, Dr. Blakemore, for joining this discussion where we've touched on lots of different topics related to AI and thinking Christianly about AI from a Christian worldview perspective. So thank you for joining us. This is, again, Seminary Unboxed, Dr. Matt Ayars, and the official podcast of Wesley Biblical Seminary.